Hello, good evening. This is Jay Steinmetz, and we're here for another episode of the Kansas Legislature, our program on Smoky Hills Public Television, where we deal with local politics coming out of the legislature in Topeka. This is a call-in show. We are taking calls from anywhere in Kansas, from questions ranging from anything that the legislature is doing in terms of politics, procedure, bills being passed, questions that you might have. Our phone number is 1-800-337-4788. Again, I'm your host, John Steinmetz, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Fort Hays State University. And we have three gentlemen here joining us tonight. We have one senator and two House reps. I'm going to go around the table and have them introduce themselves and what district they're from and the committees that they're on. Gentlemen?
Good evening. My name is Randall Hardy. I'm the state senator from Saline County and the northern half of Dickinson County. It's District 24. So I have all of those cities along I-70, Chapman, Enterprise, Solomon, Abilene. I serve on 4 committees in the legislature. I'm vice chair of a committee called Ethics, Elections, and Local Government, and I also serve on Transportation, Judiciary, and the Utilities committees.
I'm Stephen Johnson from the 108th District. I live in southern Saline County, and I'm also have all of Ellsworth County and part of Rice and McPherson counties. I chair the Tax Committee in the House. I'm on the Budget Committee, the Education Committee, and also serve on the joint House and Senate Pension Committee.
And I'm Russ Jennings, State Representative of the 122nd District. I represent Greeley, Hamilton, Kearney, Finney County, except for most of the city of Garden City, and northern Haskell County. I'm chairman of the Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee. I serve on the Judiciary Committee and Rural Revitalization, and I'm chairman of the Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight during the interim.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, and welcome to the show, gentlemen. Let's get started here with maybe a little bit of a difficult question here. Perhaps the biggest news coming out of the legislature right now is that there's not much news. Not much has really happened. Little movement on any bills that have had a chance of passing. Why is this the case? Is this a sign that Republican leaders are having a difficult time getting their members in line and getting stuff done, or are we going to see some more here in the future? Where do we stand on some of the bills in both the Senate and the House? Let's start with Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Jay. It is a difficult situation. The leadership started the session focused on 2 topics, Medicaid expansion and the abortion amendment, constitutional amendment. And they pretty much decided they wanted those 2 issues settled before we did much of anything else. And that has led to a lot of frustration on the floor of the Senate. We're still working in committees to hear and debate and work bills, but those bills are being bottlenecked before getting to the floor because the leadership has been pretty much focused on those 2 topics.
Well, let's talk about that Medicaid expansion a little bit. That's a Senate-passed bill, right? The House failed to pass it by 4 votes a couple of weeks ago. What's the process right now? It looks like this might be dead in the water. It seems as though, I think it was just today, failed to pass on a couple of motions in committee. Where are we with the Medicaid expansion bill? And also, if you could maybe mention where you stand on the Medicaid expansion bill. Are you in favor of it or against it, and why?
Sure. For the Medicaid expansion bill, that one's actually going the other way through the process, and then the life bill is going over to the House. So currently the Medicaid expansion bill is in the Senate committee. It passed through the House, and I have supported Medicaid expansion for what we need in our rural areas and what we need in the hospitals. I think on this panel we're fairly well in agreement on that. And that's currently in the Senate committee being considered. And it's definitely slowed. I don't know that it's stalled, but I don't think that initially that at least some of the Senate leaders were thinking that it might take as long as it has. But the issues crossed. So the Senate passed the issue relating to the constitutional amendment. And then there is concern in some parts, well, if there is an expansion of Medicaid, might that be able to fund abortions? And now we've got that debate of, okay, which one can move first, given that relationship. So it is that bill on the constitutional amendment that's in the House and fell short by 4 votes. I don't know that there's a committee working on that currently, or exactly the next step on the House on that amendment. But to stick with the Medicaid expansion issue, hopefully that gets us started on that topic.
And are you in support of it,
Yes.
Representative Johnson? Okay.
Yes.
And how about you, Representative Jennings?
Supportive of Medicaid
Medicaid
expansion.
expansion.
I voted for that last year. I think it's important for the rural hospitals. Most of the rural hospitals are operated by counties, and when they have a lot of unpaid care that they provide, county taxpayers end up paying the bill. We assess property taxes to help support the hospitals. I think this is an opportunity to maybe reduce some of that dependence.
Thanks for the corrections. I totally misspoke on that one. Yeah, you're right. It's the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee that had a couple of motions for Medicaid expansion bill. Those motions failed, right? What's the status on that? Where can we go from here, Senator Hardy, on Medicaid expansion? And are you supportive of Medicaid expansion?
I'm very supportive of Medicaid expansion. The Abilene Memorial Hospital in my district in 2018 had $700,000 in uncompensated bills that they had to absorb because there were no agencies they could send them to pay for the services, and if we had Medicaid expansion, then they would have that as an option for payment of their services, and it's something I strongly believe in. The bill, as it stands, it had a couple of amendments added to it on Thursday.
Work requirement amendments? Can you give us some idea
there
what
was
those amendments were?
I think there was a work requirement amendment. There was also an amendment that said that the bill could not be considered until some case in Texas was resolved, and I think that they also may be included in that the passing of the constitutional amendment as well. So right now it's pretty heavily laden. It's not clean like it once was, and so it's going to we're going to find it's going to be difficult to find a consensus on this one, I think.
Yeah, it kind of slows the process down. It seems as though there's a majority in the committee and of Senate members that have signaled support for Medicaid expansion, but with the additional amendments here, you're saying it kind of mucks up the process a little bit.
Correct. I think that the Senate committee does not necessarily mirror the body, and so that's a little bit of a different slant on the way the bill's moving. I think
Can you say more about that? What is the difference between the committee and the floor with regards to Medicaid expansion?
The committee was designed to be a little more conservative. And the more conservative side of the Republican Party is less favorable to passage of Medicaid expansion.
The relationship, the link between Medicaid expansion and the abortion amendment, it was described on our show last week as a bit of a hostage situation. Do you see that as kind of a hostage situation? Do you lament the fact that these are linked together and what seems to be really just politics, right? And maybe we can begin with you.
Well, I think it is politics. There may be some linkage, but in the bigger context, if no amendment to the Constitution is offered to the public to vote with respect to the abortion issue, then Medicaid as it currently stands has the potential of having its dollars used, in fact, the state dollars to pay for abortion services. So, I think there's a linkage there. We certainly would add more people to enrollment, but it would be 10% state dollars instead of the 45 or almost 50% of state dollars that supports Medicaid now for the general population. So they're linked. It's political. It's power political play as much as anything, and holding it hostage is a fair characterization.
What do you think, Representative Johnson? Would you agree with that, concur mostly, or?
Yeah, and it's the priorities that are there, and it would probably be easier to resolve if both were stalled on one side where you were working through, but instead you've got that on each side to try and say, well, okay, can you find a way to move forward? Well, okay, I see that you can move forward that way, but that's not quite the direction we want you to go, that we're still happy with. So there's a lot of communication that has to happen with that, and it makes it challenging.
So what do you think the prospects are for Medicaid expansion actually coming to the floor and getting out of committee in the Senate and passing? What would you say the odds would be?
There is a bill. It was actually the bill that was passed by the House last year. And it is also sitting in committee, and the one option that we have on the Senate side is if we can find 24 votes, we can pull that bill out of committee and do what the House did last year, which is called a gut and go, to remove the contents of that bill and insert the contents of the original Senate bill and then send it over to the House. Right now we're sitting at around 22 votes.
Okay.
And so we're looking for the final 2 votes that are needed to pull that bill out of committee.
Okay, 2 votes. So close, but maybe far away. Who knows?
It's pretty far away at this point.
Okay.
But I'm optimistic we'll get something done this session. As we get closer to the end, I think the desire is there. The Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Vice President, both are in support of that concept. I think they'll rally some, given that 31 states have expanded, and they are some of the larger states. We have our share in paying for Medicaid expansion across the country, and that will eventually be more of a competitive issue for us, having fewer dollars to cover uncompensated care. How do we keep our hospital model competitive as we recruit doctors, other types of things? While I think it's exceedingly difficult to pay for at the federal level, I'm not sure how that math works. Given where we are, I expect that to continue to be the law of the land with that majority of states already participating.
And have you looked in detail at the other states that have expanded Medicaid to some 30 other states and seeing what worked and what didn't and to what degree it was a success? Does that factor into some of the decisions that are made here in Topeka with regard to Medicaid expansion in Kansas?
The one advantage to not expanding Medicaid to this point is that we have a volume of information that we've been able to pore over, to see, well, what has worked and what has not worked, and so that we can avoid some of the pitfalls that other states have been subject to, whether work requirements should be part of it or other types of exemptions that have been applied for.
One of the advantages of a federalist system, right? That states are kind of laboratories for policy making.
Correct.
And you're able to see to what extent some policies are more successful than others or implementations can be successful. Have anything to add on that one?
No, I think that covers it pretty well.
Yeah, and you have the benefit of some court decisions that have interpreted what's allowable and what's not allowable to be done by states. So that gives us a little more guidance.
Just to reiterate here, this is a call-in show. We look forward to your calls out there in Kansas. The number here is 1-800-337-4788. That number is 1-800-337-4788. And let's continue on and talk about next week, what's going to happen in the Senate and the House. Not much has happened so far, but next week is a crucial week, right? Where are we in the Senate, Senator Hardy, and what do you see happening next week in terms of process?
Well, next week is a week that is called Turnaround Week in the Senate and in the House as well, where all of the committees come to a halt, and all of the bills that are passed out of committees are then considered on the floors of the House and the Senate to be worked. We'll be working on the floor all day, every day, debating bills and passing bills or not. And then at the end of the week, all of those bills are sent, the Senate bills are sent over to the House, and the House bills are sent over to the Senate for consideration. And then the committee process will start all over again.
Any bills in particular that you are championing or cautious and worried about? Anything that you want to highlight here that's going to come up next week?
There are several bills related to my particular district in Saline and Dickinson counties. I have one bill that would benefit the Eisenhower Foundation, which pays for the Eisenhower Museum and Library. It's an income tax credit, and that's something that I hope to take across the finish line this session. We have a sports betting bill that will have an amendment on the floor of the Senate that would add Greyhound racing back to the bill that was excluded by the committee. And so we'll be working on that. There's a bill that would benefit an organization called OCCK in Salina and Concordia and Abilene that helps people with disabilities to gain property tax exemption status. So those are a few of the things I'm working on.
Okay, great. How about in the House? What's on tap for next week? Big week, turnaround week. What do you have going on? What do you foresee in terms of process? Let's start with you, Representative Johnson.
Sure, thanks. So we'll be doing the same thing, hearing a number of the bills from committees. I'll be getting up to speed on most of those bills that have come out of the committees. The two main committees that I work on, the Budget Committee and the Tax Committee, are exempt committees, so we are not subject to that deadline, and we have been assembling, like pretty much every other year. Working through the budget process is on the same schedule. That is not slowed down. That has been just as intense, going through each of the agencies that are fee funded, as well as all of the other departments that come out of the state general fund, assembling that budget to get it ready for the end. Then alongside that, in tax, we're looking at what are the changes to tax policy that we can enact given where we are with the budget. The two key things that we're looking at are some increase in tax along the lines of the internet sales collections, and then some continuation of looking at what was called the windfall from last year's federal tax change. We've received, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million probably between corporate and individual income tax, and did we intend to collect all of that exactly as we are? So those are the main things we'll be looking at in those committees.
And Representative Jennings, anything to add there?
Well, I'd just say there's 40 to 45 bills that are what we call below the line that will be eligible to be considered next week. We have 3 days to do it in. Some of those will be contentious. There'll be lengthy debates, and whether or not all of them are actually heard on the floor is the call of leadership. If for some reason there are bills they don't care for or they don't wish to have a debate about, they can keep that from happening, and that's not particularly unusual. And really, it's not all that unusual that we haven't passed out of our chamber very many bills at this stage. Typically, it's you're usually low volume before you get to turnaround, then it goes crazy for a few days, and we come back and start putting things together on a more final basis. So.
Good reminder of the past.
Yeah.
We have a caller online here. This is Kent from Ellenwood. Good evening, Kent. What is your question?
Well, I've listened to the legislators discuss Medicaid expansion, and I guess my point of view is that if the federal money had been accepted back on January 1st, 2014, there'd be an additional $3 billion circulating in the Kansas economy that had been paid to hospitals and doctors. So I think it's something that should have been done a long time ago. But what I find really questionable is in the House making legislators sit in their chairs for 7 hours on the call of the House in an attempt to get them to change their vote. And then when that didn't work, the state Senate President, Susan Wagle, saying she was going to create gridlock and not let anything pass. It seems to me that being a legislator is a difficult job, and I'd like your thoughts on these kind of processes. You have to sit in a chair for 7 hours, and legislation that's totally unrelated to what the leadership doesn't like is being held up. If that makes it more difficult for you to make the decision to continue serving in the state legislature. Thank you.
Great comments there, Kent. Yeah, it's refreshing to hear a citizen say it is hard to be a legislator. It's a tough job. And Kent brings up a good point here. We were talking about there's an advantage to seeing other states implement this policy and to see whether or not it's successful. But it has meant that there are billions of dollars that are not in the Kansas economy because Kansas didn't jump on Medicaid expansion early on. And that last point I'll leave to both you representatives. There was pressure put on members in the House to sort of sit and wait this one out with regards to the abortion amendment. Comments on that and anything else that Ken had brought up?
Sure. Do you want to go first or shall I?
No, you can go
All
ahead.
right. So It wasn't a surprise. As we went in, we knew that it was very possible that we could be there for some period of time. I took the computer to the floor. The good thing is I did have time to email folks. There were a lot of people with questions and concerns on that. And I was able to have, and while I really appreciate Kent's perspective, because I would have rather done other things, but I was able to have more thorough conversations with several constituents on that particular issue as it was on the floor live. And so you make the most of that time that was there. And I was pleasantly surprised with my colleagues. While I would agree the time was overly long for how long we were there, the body itself worked to be cooperative and didn't start chewing on each other. It was just work through that time, do what you can. As the Senate President had her reaction to our action, that will be what her priorities are. It can slow some of the things down, but in terms of budget and tax, it didn't happen to have an impact on the agendas that we set and what we did in those following days. It is one of the things that can be frustrating, and often that frustration builds for a whole variety of reasons as we get further into the session. But those were some that at least I had some ability to anticipate those reactions, and I was able to work through that okay.
Yeah, I would say Kent is really insightful about this, frankly. The good news about this particular vote was that it was during daylight hours. We weren't there at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning sitting around doing nothing.
That's harder.
But I think part of what he's saying, at least what I hear him saying, is that there is work to be done on behalf of the people of the state of Kansas that go beyond a single issue or two. And we have an obligation, and I think a preference by and large, to go ahead and address issues. There's many issues beyond Medicaid expansion and the abortion amendment issue that need attention. Committees have been working hard, have been sending out recommendations for bills. Those bills should be considered by both chambers. And if the power is used to go ahead and curtail debate on issues and hold those hostage, just because we're still working on the abortion amendment or they're still working on Medicaid in the Senate, I think the entire legislature will be punished by the public in the end, and maybe deservedly so. After all, we are the people who choose our leadership.
And maybe just to push on you a little bit about that, you know, there are a lot of other really important issues. What do you think are some of the top 2 or 3 for you and your constituents, aside from the abortion amendment, Medicaid expansion? What are some of the big issues that you see that are pressing and that the legislature should be responding to?
Well, the one big issue everywhere is going to be tax. Unfortunately, we have Chairman Johnson here that helps wade through that process in excruciating detail. But, you know, we have a foster care system that is in distress, is currently under a federal lawsuit for failing to properly care for children who are wards of the state, where we have a state responsibility to take care of them. We have a corrections system that's in crisis, too many inmates, not enough beds. We still have to resolve a couple of executive reorganization orders that the governor has proposed, and we've not yet voted on those, and we may not. If we don't vote on them, then the governor has her way in those. If we do vote on them, then the legislature can inform the governor whether we accept them or not. But that's about really recreating the former Department of Social and Rehabilitation Services into a mega agency that deals with aging and children and juvenile justice issues under one roof, and that truly is a big issue. Now, it's not going to catch a lot of headlines for people. It's not a tax break, and it's not an abortion amendment, but structurally, it's very important and will impact the way that services are delivered in this state, either positively or negatively, depending on how it comes out. So, you know, we need to be able to have these conversations. And, and the risk is, at this point, some of them may not be had.
Don't forget about our highway program.
Highways.
That has been depleted over time, and we're just now getting to the point where we're stopping the flow of dollars from the highway program to the general fund to balance the budget. The governor said that with her plan that by next year we would officially close the bank of KDOT. which is something that really needs to be done. And the highways of Kansas have historically been one of our top priorities, along with education. As you drive down I-70, you can see where we're falling behind on repairs and maintenance, and that needs to stop. We need to be able to take care of our highways.
Yeah, a lot of crucial issues. If I can shift back real quick, you're on the Corrections Committee.
That's
and you mentioned before, we've had a couple of conversations in prior episodes about the fact that there are too many inmates, not enough beds. What are some real concrete solutions that the legislature can take on with regards to this issue?
So last year we took the first step and created the Kansas Criminal Justice Reform Commission. That's up and running. They've made a number of recommendations to us for this year. And they're kind of the low-hanging fruit items, not as complex as some might be. One of their recommendations is to create 244 new substance abuse treatment beds within institutions. So our institutions have two capacity issues. One is, how many beds do we have? And two is, what's our capacity to deliver programming to inmates that might influence their behavior upon their release? Substance abuse and mental health both being big issues in terms of their potential success. On the other side of this, those that are not institutionalized, again, it goes to program capacity and whether or not we can take people off the path of penetrating deeply within these systems by intervening earlier and with effective programs at the community level. And we have some bills that will do that. We're also looking at adjusting the good time rate for inmates. That good time is earned quarterly based on their behavior and conduct while in a prison and their participation in the helpful programming. So they can effectively control a bit of the length of their stay by doing well in prison, by behaving, following the rules, doing the programs, and we're looking at increasing that potential. You know, right now, our prisons across the state are very dangerous places, both because of staffing issues and the fact that there's not a lot of incentive for good behavior.
Excellent detail there. We've got another caller here, Randy from Great Bend. Good evening, Randy. What is your question?
Yeah, I got kind of a couple. I think maybe some of the other issues that could be related, granted, abortion and Medicaid expansion should be the first, but I think we should also look at how other states are handling biological male athletes competing against females and the heartbeat bill.
And by the heartbeat bill, can you give us a little bit more detail there, Randy, what you're thinking and how you want the legislature to respond?
Yeah, I think abortion should be banned after 16 weeks, after the baby's heart starts beating. You know that, it's at conception, but this should be, I think it should happen at least at heartbeat.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as though, the abortion amendment bill, which is if it passes, will bring it to the voters to empower the legislature over the issue of abortion and effectively take away the Kansas Supreme Court's ability to, legislate that issue from the bench, in other words. So the abortion amendment, it seems, from my mind, has to come first before something like a heartbeat bill. Comments about Randy's issues?
Can you go deep on that one?
I can real quickly, yes. So as it stands right now with the Supreme Court decision that we've had, applying what's called a strict scrutiny test of existing laws, most of the abortion laws that we have on the books right now, if not all, can be challenged and negated because of the conveyed right effectively by the court. So the first step has to be to the people of Kansas to decide, will we empower or re-empower, as it was prior to that decision, the legislature to regulate abortion in the state. The heartbeat legislation can't even be considered at this point effectively because we no longer have the ability under the Constitution, according to the Supreme Court, to legislate around these issues. And so that's step one. That's the first step that has to be taken.
Other comments, Representative Johnson?
I think that Russ was pretty thorough in that, and I know that heartbeat legislation has been brought, and I haven't been on the Federal and State Affairs Committee where it's been heard, but it's always been difficult to advance that as even our Kansans for Life and others groups that try to vet it seem to have trouble bringing that particular issue forward, likely for the reasons Russ mentioned.
Senator Hardy, any comments?
I do know that there was a heartbeat bill that was recently struck down. I can't remember the state that it was being considered, but it does have a rough go at it.
We've got another caller here. We have David from Salina. Good evening, David. What is your question?
Well, I have a question for all three of the gentlemen. Going back to the Sam Brownback days, and Brownback's, I guess we could call it, financial experiment, which was a absolute disaster for the state. But back in those days, we would be years and years recovering from that mess. And I'm just curious what the gentleman can tell us is being done, has been done to facilitate that recovery.
Okay, great, broad, general question. The experiment. I hear a lot about it since moving to Kansas. I sometimes call it the Brownback blowback, political and economic. Comments, thoughts about that long-term process, or looking back at the Brownback experiment and reflecting on some lessons learned. Senator Hardy?
I ran in 2016 on that. That was one of my campaign planks, was reversing the tax experiment because of what the damage being done to the highway bill, for instance, in education and other agencies. And in 2017, our first year, we were able, towards the end of the session, to reverse most of the tax policy. And what that means is that we just reintroduced the small businesses and the LLCs back onto the tax rolls. So they were once again paying income taxes like they had been prior to that time. And since that time, we've done better, and we've been able to start to backfill agencies and start to work on priorities like highways and education and some other things to bring those back to where they are. But as the caller mentioned, it's maybe a decade-long project in my way of thinking.
So we're into recovery, but
correct.
We've got a ways to go.
Correct. And Representative Johnson has a really good depth of knowledge on this one, so I'm going to pass it off to him.
Yeah, Representative Johnson, lessons learned, reflections, thoughts?
Well, thank you, and thank you, Senator. There was a lot learned. We saw that come in 2012, and I didn't happen to vote for it in 2012. I would have loved to believe that it could work. I just couldn't figure out the numbers and how it did what it was promised to do. It did not appear to work, and there were a group of us in 2015 that started very fervently acting to say, how do we close the loophole that seems to be growing? And it appeared to be meaningfully larger than what we were told it was, and indeed we found that. So we weren't successful in 15, but we were successful thanks to the folks that we had in 17 to look at that in greater detail and say, okay, again, we'd love to say it's working, but I can't find data that says it is, and we're going to have to look at changing the direction we're going to make it work. The budgets were at a low in 16 as a result. The tax that we passed was retroactive, which is a horrible thing to do, to try and get revenue in that year. But we did get it. And now we're looking at ending balances that were approaching $1 billion, because indeed the numbers were pretty massively understated in terms of the impact of that. I think the recovery is much shorter than that from the experiment. The experiment's done. It is gone and off the books, and was by 18.
So you're optimistic where we're headed?
I am. The spending holes, to be sure, are not. We've got things that have to be handled. Deferred maintenance at universities has been an issue for decades since I was a student. The roads we'll have to do some catch up on. We had to on education. That came first with the lawsuit that we have. We've got some major catching up to do in mental health. We're lucky to have Russ and the group working on corrections to say to what extent can we handle it through how many we lock up and the programs that we have, since the budget isn't fully there. But the assets are there to get us close to on track to where we were And now it's a question of what are our continuing priorities that we want to build back first. But at least from the revenue side, that flow has been stopped and gives us a chance to make some of the decisions. It's been wonderful to see the progress on CAPERS, to make the first actuarial payment since the 90s. Other things to reduce debt that have been a huge help to build back, part due to the economy. We've got to give a huge shout out to that as a meaningful part as to why it has been as positive as it is. But if you look at the ending balances, thankfully, it's a much different picture than we had seen prior to 2017.
David's right, and we went through a period of time where we went through budget and tax gymnastics in ways that had not been done in this state ever before, trying to sustain a tax plan that was destined to failure. We have not realigned budgets and tax extensively since then. We did the LLC and business thing and a little bit with personal, but deductions were changed materially during that period of time, what was deductible and what was not deductible on a state income taxes. We then had the federal tax code that made it a bigger mess. We increased the sales tax, and that included sales tax on food during that period of time. We still have that revenue, but that tax rate remains high. And you seldom hear people talk about it, but our bond debt went pretty dramatically increased during that period of time. Some of that issued theoretically for highway projects, and maybe ultimately the dollars were spent in that way, but probably in the short term those bonds may have helped float the ship in other ways. So while we're turning the corner, we're not there yet. We have a ways to go, and it will probably be still implications 10 to 15 years out of the things that we did will still be felt by others. So it's a gift to the next generation that we have for them.
We have another caller here on line one. This is Gary from Great Bend. Good evening, Gary. What is your question?
Oh, I just wondered on this Medicare, what have they found anything about it? What they're going to do about it? They'd taken mine away, and I just wondered what the deal is on that. They said that you could only make so much money and this and that to qualify for it.
To qualify for what?
Gary, can you clarify there? What was the? It's a work requirement. What was the issue again, Gary?
No, I'm on disability, and I was trying to get back on my Medicaid because they took care of stuff before, and then they took away and put me on that LBM or whatever they call it. I don't know just what it was, but it's something different, and they don't pay for nothing.
Any thoughts, comments about that, disability and Medicaid?
You know, really without knowing all of the details in quite a bit of depth, it would be hard to say. There are rules governing income limitations. If you're receiving disability payments from Social Security, it may have implications on Medicaid. Likely you may be switched over to Medicare, a slightly different program, but it's purely federal. Without the detail, it'd be really hard to say. There's an interplay that goes on between those that's very complicated.
Yeah, certainly.
Or if it was a change to having been on Medicaid and then making too much to qualify, and that changed and you had to get your own insurance somewhere else, not positive which part of the cracks that would have fallen.
I think Randy from Great Bend is back. He's got a second question here. Good evening again, Randy, and you want to add another question?
Well, I think they missed it last time. You know, I'm a Christian conservative Republican in a red state, and a lot of the LGBTQ movement is going on across the nation. Governor Kelly had some of it herself, and I was wondering what we could do to keep males from competing against females and other issues of that race.
Okay, yep. Well, that was one of her two questions. We didn't really get to that one. I know there are some state legislatures that are looking at legislation or passing bills with regards to student athletes, boys and girls, men and women playing sports. Any comments on that you have in terms of that issue?
I'm not aware of any bill that's in the hopper right now that would address that particular issue. Just not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm not either. It's certainly one we could bring up and look at in terms of the deadlines. The Federal and State Affairs Committee, which is the one that does consider that, would still have the chance to introduce a new bill if we knew what that was, and we could certainly work with Randy through his representative to make sure if that's not being considered, we at least have a bill that's drafted to look at it.
Sure.
And there is a regulatory agency right now that could be approached directly, which would be the Kansas State High School Athletic Association, governs the rules for Kansas high school athletics at least, and they have the ability to make rules for how high school athletics are conducted. So something short of legislation, often it ought to be maybe the first stop is with those kinds of folks that have a current regulatory duty.
Let's jump back into revenue taxes if we can. Just building off of the Brownback experiment, lessons learned and everything. January tax-only revenues were up $723 million, about 8.5% above estimates. 12.5% above last January. I've asked this question on the show a couple of different times. Good news? Is that really good news? Or should we remain cautious with what we have? It sounds like some of the issues that you brought up, bond and everything else, maybe indicate that we should be cautious. But does this create an overall political environment where the legislature should consider tax cuts? What do you think, Senator Hardy?
It's a tough question. As Representative Johnson mentioned, we now have an ending balance of around $1 billion, and I call that our rainy day fund. And that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. The issue is, because of our increased commitment to education, that $1 billion, if we did not spend an extra dime and bring in an extra dime of revenue, would be reduced to $92 million after 3 more years. And because of that, we need to proceed cautiously, because I am definitely committed to our commitment to education and highways, and we don't want to fall back into the situation that we were in several years ago.
Representative Johnson, your expertise is warranted on the question like this.
So it is great news. Fabulous to not only be up another $100 million for this year, but the estimates were increased in November. They were increased last April. So there's some really positive things going on in the economy, even though it doesn't always feel like that. The ag economy, oil, others, very challenging. What's happening in Wichita, certainly concerning as we look to Boeing. But that growth is helping, that is working. What we want to make sure of is, where are we collecting it? Is there a pocket that was hit harder than we might have otherwise intended? And particularly, is that a pocket that could evaporate if we are overtaxing it, which is the concern that we have in looking through the detail of the federal cuts and how those rolled through. So we have been trying to work with revenue to figure out exactly where is that coming from. Is it just growth? Awesome. We can bank that. It may not continue, but at least we know it's there. Was it coming from an unintended change in the policy? That's the type of policy we want to look at more carefully to make sure that there isn't a 4% of the population that is bearing most of that increase that may be out of balance. So that's the start to get there. But that is good news in terms of adding, again, as Russ said, the borrowing and other things will continue to have an impact. As Randall said, the spending playing forward, don't get overly excited about our current ending balance, because we have big commitments in education and other things to get shored up, and it does evaporate very quickly. But we'll be really looking at, what do we get in April when we're closing this year out, and does that remain as positive? Does that stay ahead as it has? And we'll continue to get more answers as time goes.
And I'd just say, reduce debt, pay the loans that we took out during the crisis period to help float the boat, let's stay on path we're on with capers to take care of about a $9 billion shortfall there, which will happen over time. And I think ultimately exercise discipline in this process, because it frankly is the lack of discipline in the past that has led us to be where we're at today. Mm-hmm. And if we can exercise some discipline going forward for the next several years, we can take things on a path that creates stability and certainty and tax fairness at the same time. Mm-hmm. So they're not mutually exclusive. And what we really experienced the last time was this exclusive thought that somehow just do the taxes will take care of everything, and we found out it really wrecked everything. It didn't take care of anything. So I encourage incremental approach with a great deal of discipline and caution.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. We've got another comment on the line here. This is Rhonda from Wichita. Good evening, Rhonda. What is your question?
Hi. Hi. And first of all, thank all of you for taking your Friday evenings to talk to the rest of us. I've got a question about fireworks. I understand there's been a bill come forward through the Senate which would, pretty much turn fireworks, make fireworks available statewide. I've had some nasty experiences with people and irresponsible with fireworks. Could you tell me where that legislation is and your perspective on fireworks?
Great. Thank you, Rhonda. Yeah, I moved to Hayes, and there are 4th of July. I've never experienced one. I think Kansans love their fireworks. That sounds like a Senate question from Rhonda. Are you familiar with this?
I actually think that might be a House bill.
Okay.
Is
Is it?
Or maybe if it is on the Senate side, it's on our Fed and State Committee, which is not my committee. But I think that as long as locals have the ability to regulate whether or not fireworks are permitted during certain periods of time, that's not such a big deal for me. But I think that as to when they're purchased, I think that the times that they are able to shoot them should be regulated by the local cities and counties.
We heard quite a few fireworks recently with the Chiefs' victory in the Super Bowl. Any comments about fireworks in Kansas?
Think about it this way: if beer was sold year-round but only allowed to be drank for the last 3 days of June and the first few days of July, do you think people would do it? If we sell fireworks year-round, they're going to be shot off year-round. It's going to create a lot of new work for law enforcement agencies and municipal courts and angry neighbors and fire potential, during dry seasons. I don't know that it makes sense to do that. We have. Maybe we should open up some sales around New Year's. People seem to like to shoot off guns and that. Maybe they'd shoot off fireworks instead. But 4th of July is kind of the historic firework day to celebrate the nation. And I don't know that we need to celebrate it every day of the year necessarily.
Unless the Chiefs win another
Well,
Super Bowl.
I'm all for celebrating our nation, don't get me wrong, and the Chiefs. But, I'm not sure how much it's necessary, really.
Good points. Representative Johnson, what do you think?
If it's in committee at this point and we haven't heard of it on the House or Senate side, again, Fed and State could come out later. I wouldn't be as optimistic that it would come out and be an issue. I had heard something about extending the period of licensing such that you wouldn't have to get licensed every year, that a license to sell fireworks would extend for longer, but that it wouldn't change the time that you could sell it, just that it wouldn't be that annual process of getting licensed.
I think the last thing I heard was if it's a brick and mortar store, you could sell them year round. Okay. We have the tents that come up seasonally, but some amendment on, and I think it is maybe in the Senate, Fed and State. I just not sure that's prudent myself. But.
Just to reiterate the phone number here for our call-in show, it's 1-800-337-4788. That number is 1-800-337-4788. And we have another caller, Pam from Mound Ridge. Good evening, Pam. What is your question?
Yes, I had a question. Actually, I was at the State Building a week ago Thursday. Our group came to the Capitol to listen to Representative Hubert present Bill HB 2601. And it was really to address the overreach by KDHE with vaccine mandates. And we had a lot of really amazing testimonies that day. We would like to see all of you support that bill because we feel like the overreach that happened last year, they pushed through 2 vaccines without due process. And so we have a group of thousands of Kansans that would like to see regulation on vaccine mandates, more accountability. I think you've all been receiving information from us about how unsafe vaccines are. There's a lot of risk and liability, and you cannot sue a vaccine manufacturer for any damages. And so I don't see how KDHE can say vaccines are safe when there's so much risk to them. So my question is, would you support the bill if it came on the floor? And if you wouldn't, why not?
Okay, thank you, Pam. So, question about vaccine mandates. Would you support a bill that restricted vaccine mandates or regulated, I think was the word Pam used, and if not, why not? Let's start with Senator Hardy.
Well, and I may jump in if
ahead.
that's okay.
That's fine, yeah.
I'd let the senator do it, but I was lucky to get to be with Pam in that hearing, and it was in the Education Committee. And Chairman Hubert did a great job. I wasn't sure how that would be organized with as many conferees as there were, but on both sides they were so organized and presented so well that the hearing went very well, and it presented a lot of information. So then the next question that will have to be answered by everyone probably comes down to how that bill is written, and it gets harder to get all the way there. And I know they're still working on saying, okay, exactly how do we try to advance something on this topic? How do we have that correct oversight from the legislature of what KDHE does, put in a mandated vaccine? What is the role of an agency to manage their part? I'm more familiar with CAPERS, where we delegate that investment authority, where they are better at the investing side than we are, but we very much need the oversight to say here's where those limits are. So what I'm seeing happen currently is walking through that process to see where do we think those limits are that stay in the legislature. The awareness that created, the hearing itself with KDHE will be very effective at having them say, okay, we know this matters. How do we review first the process of anything that goes on, and second, the things that are already there? The law does allow a way to opt out. I think we have to make sure that that's really clear and understood and completely available to anyone that wants to have that flexibility to say, I want the access to education without being forced through the vaccines, and that part also works. And I think if we have a bill that's written that way, that we would be able to get it through pretty handily, but I know that they're working on the details of it at the moment.
So it sounds like, seems reasonable, it sounds like it's hard to say support or not support until a bill is actually written. You've got to look at the details. Can you reiterate those, some of the details that where that's headed exactly?
Right, so I'll see if I can break it into a few categories. So one is the delegated oversight to KDHE to implement it, who will implement it, but how does the legislature reserve that piece to say, here's where you've overstepped your bounds? When, I'm trying to think of it should be on the top of my head, some of the more, I'd say, egregious ones that our folks are worried about being on the list, that KDHE assures us are not under consideration. But we have to know that, and I think that's one of the big questions that Pam is raising. How do we know that that's not going to wind up on the list? Then we take a step back and look at what's already on the list, and are there ways that I could, as a parent, say, okay, for whatever reason, I either don't want any of them, or I might agree to the science on one or two, and I've heard mixed results from different folks. I know I don't want this whole list that's there, and I don't want the whole list between 0 and 18, and I don't want this when my child is an infant. But what's on that list that needs to stay? Does there need to be the ability to pick and choose through that? But are there some that we might be able to take off? And those are the keys that are there. Then the third area is that I object to this. What is my route out that is readily available and honored, that I can make the choices for my children that I need?
Thoughts you want to add?
Well, and I agree with what Stephen said. And all of that, and balance that against the public legitimate interest of the state in public health. And I can't help but think of what's going on in China and Asian countries right now with a pandemic outbreak that's killing thousands of people. There comes a time with some issues that government has a legitimate interest in intervening into our lives to assure that the public at large is safe. Now that's not exactly this issue, but I think that's in the background of this a little bit. And then regulatory oversight is a challenge for every agency that we convey authority to establish regulations.
Yeah, and it sounds like part of the piece there is education, that there's a responsibility for the government to educate the public when it comes to, health professionals and what those things are. We're wrapping up the show. We had a great show. We covered a lot of ground, I think. A lot of interesting topics here. This is the Kansas Legislature. I'm Dr. Jay Steinmetz. Thank you for joining us on this Friday evening. We'll be back next month with some more episodes of the Kansas Legislature.